Let's look at the first pattern in the creational design patterns category, the Singleton design pattern. The Singleton design pattern solves the problems of restricting the instantiation of a class to a single instance while having a global and easy access to that single instance of the class. So we want to have only one single instance of a class. And that is basically the intent of this design pattern. So this design pattern is useful for various applications. So whenever there is one object is needed to coordinate actions across your entire application, this design pattern will be very helpful. Examples are logging applications, where you have one logging object controlling all the logs for your application. Another example is creating a single thread pool for your application only once. Another example is creating a database connection, which tends to be very expensive and resource consuming. So you want to have only one single object created when you boot and start your application. Implementation is twofold. First, we need to make the default constructor private. This will prevent other objects from using the new operator and directly instantiating objects from our Singleton class. Second, we need to create the single instance inside a special method, also known as factory method, where we call the private constructor and return a new object to the caller. To make the single and unique object shared and accessible, we store it in a global variable as a class or static variable. Recall that unlike instance variables, in class variables we get only one copy of the variable per the JVM runtime. So to sum up, implementation is two steps. One, a private constructor that will prevent client classes from directly instantiating new objects using the new keyword. Two, we create it in a special class method, so static method, and store it in a class or static variable. So let's jump in and write code to see how this can be implemented in Java. Let's write a database connection class, which is a good use of the Singleton design pattern. Let's create a database connection class with host and port number. Let's add the familiar public constructor and save it. Now let's create our main class. Let's instantiate an object and another object. Let's compare their identities to see if they are pointing to the same object. If they are equal, then we ended up with one single instance. Else, we ended up with more than one instance, which is not the Singleton design pattern. Let's print an error. Let's compile it and run it. And we got an error, so we ended up with more than one instance. So let's go back to our DB connection class and change the constructor to private. Save it. And then let's create our factory method where we instantiate an object, so we call the private constructor. Let's just make it an instance method and see what happens. So return a DB connection object as an instance method and see what happens. So let's save it. And now let's go back to the main class. Let's create an instance object. I think we need to add a public default constructor. That way we can call the instance methods. So let's call it DB. So that way we can call the instance method get instance. So this is get instance. We call db.get instance, and we get db1, db.get instance, and we get db2. So let's save it. Now compile and run, and we got an error. So we ended up with more than one object. Let's go back to our DB connection class and change the get instance method into a static method. Let's delete that default constructor. Let's save it. Let's go back to the main class and then remove this DB instance. We don't need it. And let's call the class method using the class name because it's a static method. And the rest should be the same. So let's save it and then compile and run. And we got another error. So if we go back to the DB connection class, we can see that the get instance method, inside this method, we keep returning a new object every time it gets invoked. So even though it's a static method, we are just returning a new object. So we're not saving this new object in a global static variable. So that's why we get that error. So we need to create a global variable and store that instant in that global static variable. So it has to be a static variable, class variable, so that way it's shared among all instances. So we check here. If it's null, then we assign it. So we assign the global static variable, our DB connection instant, and then let's just keep returning it. Let's just return it in one line. So return DB. So save it, and let's save and compile. So let's compile it and run. And we got one instance. So now we have implemented the Singleton design pattern. So to sum up, let's open up the DB connection class. So we made the constructor private. We created a global static variable, and we created a factory method called get instance, and we check if the global static variable is empty or is null. Then we assign it. Otherwise we return it. Okay, so let's go to the main class. So the main class, we create two instances. We compare their identity. If they are pointing to the same object, that means we only have one single instance. Otherwise we had multiple instances. And that's how you implement the classic Singleton design pattern.